Hi, everyone. So for those who don't know me, my name is Bob Ingram, and I have I am the author of quite a few books on American history, on Ben Franklin, William McKinley, Abraham Lincoln, George Washington, and others, as well as other things. And those books are available on Amazon, which you will find on my author page, Robert Ingram. So that said, there will be no more self-promotion in this discussion. We're going to talk about the Erie Canal, uh, and on the one hand, this is going to be uh, characterized by a lot of historical material because it is a discussion of the creation and the building of the Erie Canal. So there is a lot to go through. On the other hand, though, I think it's necessary to preface that narrative um, by just asking the question, why now? Why today? Well, actually, one of the reasons to discuss it now, although probably very few people on this call realize this, is that this is the 200th anniversary. 2025 is the 200th anniversary of the completion of the Erie Canal. In fact, about 2 weeks ago, I forget the exact date, I think it was October 26th. So only about 2 weeks ago was the exact 2 year anniversary, the day upon which the Erie Canal opened. So this is the bicentennial of the Erie Canal. And they have that, although it's gotten almost no notice nationally, it is worth noting that throughout this year, there are a lot of local and other celebrations and activities in New York State, particularly along the route of the Erie Canal, where they're having parties and speeches and things like that. So there is some recognition being given to it. But outside of the bicentennial, the question does arise, why discuss the Erie Canal right now? Given all of the political turmoil we're seeing. What about this? What about that? And why would this be important? Well, uh, I am firmly of the belief that most Americans, and I include in that many people who are supporters of Donald Trump, who are involved in the MAGA movement, simply don't know enough about American history and about the actual fight to create, to defend, and to develop our republic for now almost 250 years. Um, and there are great lessons to be learned, great truths to be learned, to be uncovered, um, which is why I've made a point of writing the books that I've written. Um, you know, um, Individuals like Abraham Lincoln or George Washington or Ben Franklin, um, uh, as I mentioned in I think one or two previous classes, in one of his speeches, William McKinley said, principles always come first. And then he went on to say, we rarely live up to our principles. And I am of the firm belief that if we are going to win the fight that we are engaged in today, we must understand not simply the policies like keeping out illegal immigrants, keeping transgenderism out of the schools and stuff like this, not just the policies, but we have to understand the principles that we are defending, the principles that go back to the early founding of this country and which shaped this country and which really defined our culture. Now, the Erie Canal is a truly remarkable subject to discuss because on the one hand, it reflects a key component of our culture, a culture which uh, still exists, even though it's been damaged, been forgotten by many people. It is still there. It is still part of what makes us Americans, um, in terms of how this country was built. Um, and uh, and on the other hand, I mean, if you look at you know Trump's slogan, his slogan, which is a pretty simple slogan: "Build, baby, build." Well, that certainly characterized the Erie Canal, and the uh, this is if you eliminate that, if you eliminate that impulse, if you eliminate that commitment from American society, from American culture, then our republic vanishes. It no longer becomes viable. You may still have an elected House of Representatives, an elected Senate. Who knows, how these things will go. You may still have, the structure and the trappings of government, but without that commitment to human development, to building a productive future, then the American Republic really has no meaning anymore. It really has no it really doesn't exist anymore as a living force in human society, in human history. Um, if you look at our culture over the last, what has happened to our culture, particularly with younger people, but it's affected everyone over the last, say, 2 to 3 decades, what has been imposed upon us. And I would say that the presidency of Barack Obama was certainly a key inflection point where this dramatically worsened, but it didn't start with Obama. I mean, we have a society right now, particularly in many of our urban centers, New York, Detroit, you could go down the list of a lot of the major cities in the country. It essentially operates the way the way the society operates, the way these cities operate. It operates on the Roman Empire model of bread and circuses. Bread, the Roman Empire gave, Rome, the city of Rome, at the time of Jesus Christ and later, the vast majority of the people were impoverished. The question is how to keep them in line, how to keep them from revolting, how to keep them from killing all the aristocrats. And bread and circuses. The government of Rome handed out every day uh, thousands and thousands of loaves of free bread, which were given away to the people of Rome. And then on the other hand, you had the circuses, the Colosseum, the entertainment, which became increasingly debauched. I had a discussion some weeks ago about some of the mystery cults and all of that in Rome. But it was bread and circuses for the population to keep them, you know, from revolting and to keep them distracted with increasingly degenerate forms of entertainment. Well, doesn't that sort of characterize the trend in America over the recent decades? Isn't the way that the Democratic Party has controlled a lot of these cities? You know, um, uh, you know, uh, you know, it's, the you know where you've got uh, an enormous amount of government handouts, um, uh, to one degree or another. Uh, you know, free food, like with the SNAP program, free health care, free this, free that. Um, so you're giving people the minimum they need to exist. You're not helping them to a better life. You're not advancing their condition at all. You're giving them the minimum they need to exist for free. And then you add into that mix the circuses, which is all kinds of free, degenerate entertainment, whether it's pornography or whether it's something else, or gaming, or TikTok videos, combined with legalized drugs, right? And so you're controlling the population. You're controlling them through bread and circuses. And this has been the downward trend we've been living through for quite some time. It is, now this is what Donald Trump has been battling. His battle has been to rebuild America as a productive economy in which not only are you giving people the opportunity to lead decent lives and to, raise families and to have, the ability to advance, but you're also creating a new mindset where people's identity becomes, a productive identity, so to speak. That may be stretching it a little bit, but a productive identity, um, in which people regain hope in the future, regain, the belief that they are going to leave the society and the nation, and potentially the world, a better place for their children and grandchildren with more opportunities. Um, and this really, raises the question of the Erie Canal, because if you look at what was done with the Erie Canal, um, and you look at the mindset, that created this really, you know, unbelievable Renaissance project. Um, this is precisely what we need to revive today. Not just projects like this. People say, well, what are the big infrastructure projects today? That's not what I'm talking about, really, because there's a lot we need to do. But I'm talking about, sort of flipping a switch. Although you can't flip a switch, but uh, you know, flipping a switch or turning on the light bulb in the minds and the hearts of tens of millions of Americans to begin to start thinking in this kind of way, that there is nothing we can't do. This is what John Kennedy used to talk about. There is nothing we can't accomplish as a nation if we set our minds to it, and we can make our society and our nation more productive, more prosperous, happier. That is within our power to do that. So I present to you this discussion of the Erie Canal, and the way I view it is that this is sort of an antidote, to the all of the efforts to turn people into pessimists. Oh, Trump is not doing this. This guy's not doing that. Oh, look at what so and so did. To feed pessimism. Well, the Erie Canal is the exact opposite of that. And this is the way we've got to get people to start to think. Now, why don't you put up the first two pictures? Well, first one and then two. All right, Tony?
Yep.
All right, so this is just one of the posters of the celebrations that are going on in New York State now to celebrate the 200th anniversary of the Erie Canal. This is a local one, where I guess they had some kind of, celebration in Cayuga County in upstate New York. But that's just an example that there are people paying attention to this right now. And go to the second one. Okay. Um, these are the two individuals who are most responsible for the building of the Erie Canal. There were many other very good people, great people, and we'll get into some of them as we go along. But without these two individuals, the canal would have never been built. It just simply would not have been built. The first is Gouverneur Morris, who was the close friend of George Washington, the man who really wrote the U.S. Constitution. He wrote the preamble to the Constitution outright, and he also sort of rewrote a lot of the sections of the Constitution. And, he was an intimate collaborator and friend of Alexander Hamilton's. And he was the one who first proposed building the Erie Canal. If you hear stories that there was someone else who first proposed it, it's not true. He was the first one to propose it in 1777 during the Revolutionary War. Um, he was up at Fort Ticonderoga, and they had to abandon Fort Ticonderoga because the British Burgoyne was coming down from Canada, and they couldn't resist Burgoyne's army at that point. Not until later at Saratoga, but at that point they couldn't resist Burgoyne's army, so they evacuated the fort. They headed south. They were basically, fleeing from Burgoyne's army, and he had a meeting during this flight with a large group of senior Army officers. He was not in the Army. And it was at that meeting that he proposed to them that a canal be built from the Hudson River to Lake Erie. And because that was sort of the territory they were traveling through as they headed south. And that was the first proposal. And then, as you will see as we go along, his role, in the initial part of this fight was paramount, was critical. Then you have DeWitt Clinton. He did not really come into the canal project. It's not really clear the precise date. I don't think you can give a precise date. But he didn't come in a big way into the canal project until 1807, 1808, 1809. But then he became very quickly the leader. And after Gouverneur Morris died in 1816, it was Clinton, and Clinton alone, really alone, with allies. But, it's like saying Trump is not alone, but without Trump, the people who are Trump's allies would still not be Trump. And it was Clinton who really was the man who was responsible for the canal being built, and his role cannot be underplayed. So you could take those down. Now, you have to stop and consider what it was that Gouverneur Morris proposed in 1777, building a canal from the Hudson River to Lake Erie. Although you may or may not be aware of this, nothing like what Clinton proposed had ever been built before in human history, ever. Nowhere in the world. Not in ancient Greece, ancient Rome, ancient Egypt, not in India, not in Central Asia, not in the various Islamic caliphates and empires. No one had built a canal like this. Now, you did have the Grand Canal in China, which is very long, much longer than the Erie Canal. But there's two things to, be aware of in terms of the Grand Canal. First of all, it was built over a span of well more than 1,000 years. I don't know, it started like 400 BC or something like that, 600 BC. It started really a long time ago with the first canal. And it was built in pieces over more than 1,000 years, 1,200 years, something like that. And secondly, it wasn't one canal. They would build some canal that would be 50 miles long or 100 miles long, and then it would sit there for 200 years, and then someone else would come along and build another canal to connect to it, and that might be 100 miles long or something like that, 150 miles long. So, the Grand Canal was built not only over 1,000 years, but it was built in many, many, many individual segments. And none of these were as long as the Erie Canal. None of them. So, which is not to take anything away from it. The Grand Canal in China was a stupendous project. But if you just sort of put that to one side for a moment, um, otherwise, nothing like this had ever been built before. Um, there was a canal in France uh, uh, called the um, Canal du Midi, I believe. It was in southern France. This was built in the 17th century um, under Colbert's uh, leadership. But uh, first of all, the Erie Canal was 2.5 times longer than the Canal du Midi over much, much more difficult and treacherous terrain. Um, and and outside of that one French canal, there was not a canal anywhere in Europe at the time of the American Revolution or later in the early 19th century. There was not a canal in Europe that was 100 miles long. Most of them were 20 miles long, 30 miles long, things like this. Uh, the um, uh, the, uh, the longest canal uh, in um in uh, uh, in England at the time the Erie Canal was built. The longest canal was called the Bridgewater Canal, and it was only about 40 miles long. Um, so what you know what Morris proposed was really it's it was astounding. Um, he proposed a canal from the Hudson River to Lake Erie. It would be 363 miles long. 363 miles long. Um, the elevation from Lake Erie to the Hudson River, the elevation of the land dropped by almost 600 feet between Lake Erie and the Hudson River, which necessitated numerous locks that had to be built. They ended up building 83 locks. Also, what was required were numerous elevated aqueducts, and this would be built essentially primarily over what was wilderness in upstate and western New York, over gorges, over marshes, over rivers. Um, uh, you know, the um, uh, it was absolutely really treacherous landscape for building something like this. Now, in the article that I wrote, I talked about the Renaissance and the Dome of Florence. I'm not going to go into that tonight for time reasons, but it is important to make um, these 2 points. One is that nothing like the Erie Canal had ever been built before in human history. It was a Renaissance project. And the other point to make is that when they built it, no one, when they made the decision to build it, or when Morris proposed to build it, um, no one in America, no one in what became the United States, um, had any idea how to build it. Nobody, you know, um, the and no one had the skills to build it either. When they first appointed the Erie Canal Commission, which was in 1810, they chose two men to be the chief engineers of the project to build the Erie Canal. Now, one of these was a man named Benjamin Wright, and the other was a man named James Geddes. Now, both of these men were lawyers. They were not engineers, they were not builders, they had never built anything in their lives. They were lawyers. And then later, they added two more, quote unquote engineers. So they had four of them to the project. One was a man named Charles Broadhead, who was a judge. And the fourth one was a man named Nathan Roberts, who was a school teacher. None of these men were engineers. None of them were builders. Um, the In a sense, the building of the Erie Canal became um, uh, a school of engineering. They learned as they went along. They learned as they built it. Um, and what you see in the building of the canal is that they developed many um, new construction methods, many new skills, many new tools, many new inventions. Um, I mean, for instance, when it came, I'll discuss this a little later, but when it came to building the most difficult series of locks, which was near Buffalo, in a place called Lockport, where they had to build a series of locks, not just one lock, but a series of locks going up a cliffside. Um, this guy, Nathan Roberts, who had been a school teacher, um, basically sent away for a bunch of books on engineering and locked himself in a room for several days, reading these books and studying them. And then, came out and had his own innovations, which he put into it. He didn't just copy what was in the books. Out of the books, he developed his own approach, and they built these locks. But as I said, they they learned as they built, and they confronted a whole series of challenges, which on the surface, some of these challenges seemed insurmountable. Um, but they overcame them, through inventiveness, through creativity, through new ideas. Now, a whole bunch of other people who, um, uh, well, to just give you a little bit more of the chronology, um, in 1800, so this is after the Revolutionary War, uh, Gouverneur Morris submitted an official proposal. This was not just a conversation. He submitted an official proposal to the New York State Legislature to build a canal from the Hudson River to Lake Erie. That was in 1800. And then in 1801, he conducted a personal tour of upstate New York. He just went with himself and a couple of friends, and they toured the whole region, between Albany and Buffalo, where he fine-tuned his proposal. And at that point, the project begins to take on real substance, real life. And a number of people joined in the project. None of these are well known today, and the names probably won't mean much to you, but I'm going to give you the names anyway. One is Jonas Platt, who was a Federalist congressman from Utica. Another was Jesse Hawley, who wrote a series of 14 essays polemicizing for a canal to Lake Erie. Others included Stephen Van Rensselaer, Canvas White, Thomas Eddy, and John Jervis. And Jervis is a perfect example. He was a very young guy. I don't know, like 19, 20 years old or something. He was a very young guy, and he got hired on as an assistant surveyor. As they're moving along, he's surveying the land ahead, for the best possible route. And he got hired as an assistant surveyor, and step by step by step, he worked himself up. He proved himself to be indispensable. He came up with ideas, came up with decisions that proved to be accurate, and he kept getting promoted. And by the time that the canal was finished, he was the chief superintendent of the Eastern Division of the canal. And that sort of exemplifies what occurred. I said that this was sort of America's original school of engineering. And in fact, if you look at a number of these people, like Geddes, like Jervis, like Roberts, and a bunch of others, who built the Erie Canal, the people who actually built it, um, later on, they became um, chief engineers out of their experience in building the Erie Canal. They became the chief engineers on the building of other canals, as well as building other things, water projects, aqueducts, railroads. A lot of the original railroads that were built in the Erie Canal are built in the United States. A lot of the original railroads, the chief engineers on some of those projects were people who had worked on the Erie Canal. Um, so we developed out of this project sort of a new class, a new student body, graduate body of people who became leading engineers in the United States. Um, so the in 1810, Dewitt Clinton, who was then the mayor of New York City and who had a fair amount of political clout in New York State, he convinced the state legislature to form what was called the Erie Canal Commission. The first chairman of the Erie Canal Commission was Gouverneur Morris. And then later, a number of years later, he stepped down and he was succeeded by Dewitt Clinton. So Dewitt Clinton became the second chairman of the Erie Canal Commission. The first action they took was to take a group of these commissioners, the people who were on the commission, and send them on a fact-finding tour of upstate New York, sort of replicating the trip that, Gouverneur Morris had taken on his own 9 years earlier, but to go to upstate New York and examine the entire route, and to come up with proposals on where and how this canal was going to be built. And just to name the names of some of the people who were on this, fact-finding commission, Gouverneur Morris, Dewitt Clinton, Stephen Van Rensselaer, Simon Dewitt, who's no relation to Dewitt Clinton, Thomas Eddy, and a number of others. And this was a 3-month journey, a month and a half from Albany to Buffalo, a month and a half back, very arduous. It was carried out by small boats over various rivers like the Mohawk River, the Genesee River, certain lakes, carriages, stages, horseback, under very, very arduous conditions. But they did carry out this surveying, trip. They came back to Albany, and in 1811, they submitted their report from this journey. They submitted their report to the New York State Legislature. It was actually Gouverneur Morris who appeared before the legislature, submitted the report, and submitted testimony from the various elected officials. And what Morris was adamant about is that in his testimony and in the report was that whatever other decisions were made, that this must be a canal to Lake Erie, not a canal to Lake Ontario, not a canal north to Lake Champlain, which some people were proposing, but this must be a canal from to Lake Erie. And in his speech to the legislature, he said the following: "When the records of history shall have been obliterated, and the tongue of tradition have converted the shadowy remembrance of ancient events into childish tales of miracles, this national work shall remain. It shall bear testimony to the genius, the learning, the industry, and the intelligence of the present age." Now, a year after this uh, report by the commissioners, Robert Fulton was recruited, and he became a new commissioner. You know, he became he became a new member to the Erie Canal Commissioners. Now, Fulton had just recently instituted his steamboat service from New York City to Albany. And, you know, he was being touted as the great man who had, you know, introduced the steamboats on the Hudson River. So him coming on board the Erie Canal Commission gave it even more political weight. And at that point, in 1811, 1811, um, Morris, Clinton, and Fulton um, went on tour throughout New York. These were speaking engagements, and I think they didn't go together. I think they went separately. I'm not exactly sure of all the details, but you know, together between Gouverneur Morris, Dewitt Clinton, and Robert Fulton, they toured the state in 1811, speaking in city after city and town after town, you know, organizing the population to support the Erie Canal. And and during this same time, Clinton issued a series of pro-canal articles, which were published in the New York Evening Post, which was the newspaper which, up until his death, had been owned by Alexander Hamilton. Um, so in 1812, Gouverneur Morris and DeWitt Clinton, traveling together, went down to Washington, D.C., and they met with members of the U.S. Senate, the U.S. House of Representatives, and with President Madison. They had a personal meeting with President Madison. And what Morris and Clinton proposed was that the federal government help fund the building of the canal. That this should be supported and at least partially financed by the national government as a project, you know, for the benefit of the entire nation. Madison turned them down flat, and told them that it was his view that the federal financing for internal improvements was unconstitutional, and that he would not support this, and that if Congress passed legislation to fund it, he would veto that legislation. So, you know, that was a pretty strong rejection by Madison. And I will say, without getting sidetracked here, that this rejection by Madison of the Erie Canal, this was in January of 1812, was a significant contributing factor in the decision by DeWitt Clinton to run for president and to challenge James Madison in the 1812 presidential election. And for those who don't know the story on that, DeWitt Clinton came within a hair's breadth of defeating Madison in the 1812 election. You know, it was very, very close. You know, putting that to one side, what then happened, of course, in 1812 was the War of 1812. And the governor of New York at that time was a man named Tompkins, Governor Tompkins. I think Daniel Tompkins, I'm not sure, but Tompkins. And he was a very close ally of, James Madison. He later became James Monroe's vice president, but he was part of the Jefferson Madison political machine. And what happened after war was declared in 1812 is he announced that he was putting the state on a full war mobilization, and that all of the economic resources of the state were going to go into raising money for the army, the militia, ammunition, defense, and everything else was going to be curtailed. And as part of his war mobilization actions, he convinced the state legislature to repeal the Canal Act of 1810. That was the act that had committed New York to build the canal and that had established the Erie Canal Board of Commissioners. Well, in 1814, the Canal Act was repealed, the Board of Commissioners was disbanded, and by the end of 1814, really the Erie Canal project was dead for political reasons, not for any, engineering reasons. And it was really at this point that the leadership of DeWitt Clinton fully emerged. We're talking late 1814, early 1815. And this only became even more prominent after 1816 when Gouverneur Morris died. But in 1815, on his own, DeWitt Clinton undertook another statewide speaking tour all over the state throughout 1815, one city, one town after another, organizing support, collecting petition signatures, putting pressure on state legislators. And this culminated in a mass meeting in New York City on December 3rd, 1815, where, there were, an overflowing meeting in New York City of Canal supporters. And Clinton delivered the keynote speech at that meeting, which was then not only published, but reprinted as a pamphlet, and thousands of copies of it began to circulate. Following the success of that mass meeting, in early of 1816, one of the state legislators named Peter Augustus Jay um, uh, uh, introduced legislation to to restart the canal project. And Peter Augustus Jay was the son of John Jay. And then in well, I need to get to the project itself, so I'm going to just cut some of this out. But the next key point, because still the project wasn't going anywhere, So in 1817, Clinton announced his candidacy for governor of New York, and he took office in the spring of 1817, and he was inaugurated on July 1st, 1817, as governor. And 4 days later, or 3 days later, on July 4th, they began construction of the canal in Rome, New York, which is a town up in that area. So from the moment Clinton takes over the governorship in 1817, the building of the canal, begins. So, just to get on to the canal itself, well, I'll just say that they confronted enormous problems, enormous problems. One of the things they did right from the beginning, there's a lot of rivers and a lot of streams and a lot of lakes in upstate New York. And there have been proposals that somehow this waterway to Albany, to Buffalo, could utilize these streams and lakes and rivers. But that idea was thrown out fairly early. And what was decided was that this was going to be entirely a man-made canal, entirely a man-made canal. None of it would be over natural waterways. And that and that decision involved enormous difficulties. I mean, if you just think about, you know, uh, Upper New York State was a wilderness. They had to cut down literally tens and tens and tens of thousands of trees. Um, they had to dig a canal that was 40 feet wide, 4 feet deep. It had to be level. They had to construct numerous locks. They had to build through solid, they had to dig through, in many places, solid bedrock. Um, they had to cross swamplands. They had to cross rivers. In some places, they had to go up or down near vertical cliffs. Um, and they ran into many, many other problems. Um, Over 50,000 workers were recruited to work on the canal. All of them were young men, all of them. Over 50,000 workers were recruited, and about somewhere around a third of them, maybe a little more, maybe a little less, but about a third of them were immigrants, largely Irish immigrants, not exclusively, but largely. And the way they did this was kind of interesting, which is that the people building the canal sent hiring teams down to New York City, and they met the immigrant boats as they came into New York City, and the immigrants would walk down the plank, the gangway to get off the boats, and as they stepped onto the pier, uh, these hiring agents would be there and say, "Do you want a job? We're building a canal upstate. We're paying high wages. And if you want a job, come with us." And by nightfall, hundreds of these immigrants would be, in stages and wagons and other, boats headed north to work on the canal. Um, the um, they built 53. Excuse me. One of the yeah, we'll get into the locks a little bit, but one of the most amazing things about the canal was the aqueducts. They built 32 aqueducts. Now, these are not like the Roman aqueducts, because for people who don't know, I mean, you should know, the Roman aqueducts brought water into Rome and certain other cities, but they were not navigable waterways. There were no boats on the Roman aqueducts, and um, the in building the Erie Canal, they built 32 navigable aqueducts, and some of them were really extraordinary. The one in Schenectady was 1,200 feet long. It had 26 stone piers. The one at Rochester had the longest stone arch bridge in the world. It had 11 Roman arches. Um, and that sort of thing. So I'm not going to go through all of it now, but at a certain point, the it almost got stopped. I mean, um, they built the central section first. They divided it into three sections: western, central, and eastern. And they built the central section first because it was largely over level ground. It was the easiest to build. Um, and then they completed the eastern section. And in 1823, the eastern section was joined to the central section. So between the eastern section and the central section, it was over 200 miles long. And at that point, they're nearing, completion of the canal. But at that point, um, the Democratic Party, Democratic Republican Party, the Jeffersonian Party in New York, um, maneuvered to deny Clinton another term as governor. He could have legally been governor again, but they moved to deny him as another term as governor, and they dumped him. And a guy named Yates, Joseph Yates, who was a stooge of Martin Van Buren, was elected as governor. And and following Yates' inauguration, one of his first actions was to fire Clinton and Stephen Van Rensselaer from the Erie Canal Commission. So here they are in sight of almost completing the canal, and the Governor Yates and his cronies moved to oust Clinton, oust Rensselaer, and basically stop the canal project dead in its tracks. So what Clinton did at that point is in the next election in 1824, he ran for governor again, but he knew he was not going to get the backing, of the Madison Monroe, Democratic Republican Party. So he ran a third party campaign. They created a new party called the People's Party, and he ran a third party campaign. He was swept back into office. And as soon as he got inaugurated, they pressed ahead rapidly to build the canal. It was completed on October 26th, 1825, with Clinton as governor. They had a huge celebration. They sailed a flotilla of ships all the way, boats and ships, all the way from Buffalo down through the canal to Albany, down the Hudson River. They came to Manhattan. They had a gigantic celebration along the route of the Erie Canal. Every town that they passed fired off cannons. People that were singing, there were, all kinds of things. And when they got to New York Harbor, they had this big, big celebration. And Dewitt Clinton he had been on the whole thing. He had gone to Buffalo and he had traveled the whole route. And he had brought from Buffalo a keg containing water from Lake Erie. And when they got to New York Harbor, they had a ceremony called the Marriage of the Waters, where he poured the water from Lake Erie into New York Harbor, and and the canal was opened. So look, I probably spent too much on the political fight, but it is important to recognize the fight that occurred. It wasn't like someone just said, "Hey, let's build the Erie Canal," and everyone said, "Oh yeah, that's a great idea." This was an enormous battle. First to convince people that it could be done, that it was not just some insane idea to build a canal, the likes of which had never been built in the history of the human species. And then secondly, to overcome massive political opposition, in Washington, D.C. and in Albany and in other places, trying to stop this repeatedly over a period of more than 20 years. Now, let's run through some of these slides real quick, Tony. We're just going to run through these. Okay. We're not going to dwell on any of these. Next one. Oh, yeah. I should have shown some. This is the canal route. You can see it um, from Albany over on the right. And you can't really see all the towns, but it goes through Schenectady, then up through Syracuse, over through Rochester, and there are many, many smaller cities along the way. You see, just to the east of Syracuse is Rome. That's where they started building the canal, the central section. Then you get to Rochester and then down through Lake Lockport and into Buffalo. And it flows into Lake Erie below Niagara Falls. So the next slide. This is just another picture of it. Maybe a little bit clearer. It shows it going through. It looks like on this map like it goes through Oneida Lake, but it doesn't. That just is a misconception you get from looking at the map. They did not go through any lakes. It traveled along the side of the lake, but again, you can see the route there. The two most difficult parts to build the canal was the part around Troy and Syracuse in the east, and then the area from Lockport to Buffalo, because this was where there were just treacherous drops in elevation, and they had to build numerous locks um, on the eastern and western ends of the canal. Next one. These are some of the people who I mentioned. Benjamin Wright. He eventually, by the time the canal was built, he became the chief engineer. Even though he had been a lawyer, he became the chief engineer of the entire project as it eventually developed. Stephen Van Rensselaer, he went on in 1824. He was the third Erie Canal commissioner after Clinton. He was a very important guy in building the canal. Um, he was a very close ally of John Jay. He was John Jay's lieutenant governor when Jay was governor earlier. And in 1824, he founded what became eventually the Rensselaer Polytech Institute, which was the first and the premier engineering school in the United States of America. It was founded in Troy, which is on the Erie Canal, it was an extremely important institution. Jonas Platt, the Federalist congressman, he played a very important role in the New York legislature. Jesse Hawley, who I mentioned, who wrote all these essays. Go on to the next one. These are just some of the others. I won't say a lot about them. James Geddes, Peter Augustus Jay, Simon DeWitt, Canvas White. Canvas White was an interesting guy. The problem with the locks was, that some of the earlier short canals that had been built, both in the United States, 10-mile canals, 5-mile canals, there were some of them that had been built. They had been built out of wood. The wood rotted out. They had locks on them, and normal cement wouldn't work. And he actually developed a new form, never before seen form of non-porous cement. This is one of the things that was invented, was necessitated, as they say, necessity is the mother of invention. They used his non-porous cement to build the locks on the canal. It would not erode. It would not crumble. It would last. It was strong, and Canvas White developed it. All right, go on to the next one. This is just a picture of the canal. You could see it. Um, you know, the initially, you could see on the left there these horses. You can't really see the rope, but initially the boats on the canal were pulled by either horses or mules. People think it was mules, but mostly they used horses, some mules. Later, there was a big renovation of the canal around the time of the Civil War. All sections of it were rebuilt. It was widened. It was deepened. The locks were made better. And the big renovation of the canal allowed them to use certain types of steamships on the canal. But initially, for the first, 20 to 30 years, the boats were pulled by horses and mules. Next one. This is obviously later, because you see these buildings which were not there, when the canal was built. But this gives you some sense of it. This is in Buffalo, some kind of rendition of it. Next one. All right, here's one of the aqueducts. This is crossing the Mohawk River near Schenectady. Now, in case it's not clear to you, the water you see there is not the Erie Canal. The water you see there is the Mohawk River, and that structure going across the river is the Erie Canal. There's water on top of that structure. navigable water. And there are boats going, up and down that, cross it, to cross the Mohawk River. Next one. This is another aqueduct. This is at Rochester. And again, you see the water underneath those arches. That's the Genesee River. And the canal is crossing the Genesee River near Rochester. Next one. This is just a picture of one of the locks that was built. But why don't you just go to the next one? No, the next one. These are the locks at Lockport. And this is a series of locks going up and down. This was built out of, essentially rock, which they had to dig away at. And they built these series of locks, one after the other, with boats going up on the right and boats coming down on the left. So they were able to travel in two directions. That's at Lockport. And there's another picture of it in the next slide. And this is the same thing. Now, obviously, these are, I don't know, drawings or paintings or maybe something taken from a photograph and colorized. These are much later on. This is not how it looked in, 1830. But, there were no photographs in 1830. But that's the same series of locks at Lockport. Next one. That's the Marriage of the Waters. That's Dewitt Clinton pouring Lake Erie water into New York Harbor. Next one. I just want to give you one sense of it. This is obviously later on, but a sense of what developed, because if you look at the writing there, it says General Electric Works at Erie Canal and Erie Canal at Schenectady. So you see the canal, you see the boats there, and those buildings, which are probably brick buildings, that is a General Electric's work. So this is probably like 1900 or something. That's a General Electric work. And what you had along the Erie Canal was a massive, massive economic development and population growth. I mean, all of these cities, Albany, Utica, Rochester, Schenectady, Buffalo, I mean, they went from having 1,000, 2,000 people, in 1820 to by 1860, they had populations of 50,000, 60,000. Buffalo went from under 2,000 people in 1820 to 81,000 in 1860. It was the 10th largest city in the United States. And massive industries and manufacturing and all kinds of mills were built along the canal. So the next one. And you could see that what this meant. Forget some of these city names. I don't know where they come from, but the thing to pay attention to is the red line, and forget this stuff up here in Lake Ontario. This is really not a good map, but mostly I'm doing it to show you the route from Buffalo out to Chicago and out to Milwaukee, because what occurred once the Erie Canal was built was not just economic growth, but a massive, massive immigration to the West and the populating of all of these states. It's estimated that between 1825 and 1860, or 1861, between the time the date that the canal was opened and the beginning of the Civil War, well more than 1 million people immigrated by the Erie Canal. Not other routes. I mean, maybe people went other routes, but over 1 million people, went down the Erie Canal to points west, to Ohio, to Michigan, to Indiana, to Illinois, to Wisconsin, and populated this region. And anyway, go to the next one. Yeah, now I just want to conclude with this, um, because you'll see if you could see there's two brown lines. One is the Erie Canal, which was finished in 1825, going from Albany to Buffalo. And then you see to the left, there's a second brown line, and that's the Ohio Erie Canal, which went from Lake Erie at Cleveland down to the Ohio River, right? Now, the um, uh, uh, the chief engineer for the Ohio Erie Canal was James Geddes, who had played a major role in building the Erie Canal. So he went from, being, very important in building the Erie Canal. He immediately became the chief engineer on the Ohio Erie Canal. The Ohio Erie Canal was person responsible for it was the governor of Ohio named Thomas Worthington, who was a very close friend and political ally of Dewitt Clinton. And in 1812, he had publicly endorsed and campaigned for DeWitt Clinton when Clinton challenged James Madison in the presidential election. Now, what happened was the Erie Canal was completed in 1825, and the very same year the Erie Canal was completed, they began construction on the Ohio Erie Canal, and that was completed in 1832. So by 1832, you could go from New York Harbor up the Hudson, across the Erie Canal, down Lake Erie to Cleveland, and then all the way through the interior of Cleveland to the Ohio River. And from the Ohio River, you could get to Kentucky, Indiana, Illinois, and over to the Mississippi River. So this opened up the entire interior of this area, um, to transportation, to trade, to economic development, to immigration, to population growth. And you have to realize that in Ohio, Ohio in 1820, I have it written down here somewhere, but I'm not going to bother trying to look it up. Uh, Ohio had a population of like, I don't know, 40,000, 50,000, something like that. I mean, it was very small. It was well below 100,000 people. By 1860, Ohio was the third most populous state in America. By 1860, the third most populous state. It was booming, massive immigration, massive economic development. And this is what the Erie Canal made possible, and then in conjunction with the Ohio and Erie Canal. Now, the Ohio Erie Canal was 308 miles long. So consider this: when the Ohio Erie Canal was completed in 1832, the longest canal in the world, not counting the Grand Canal in China, the longest canal in the world was the Erie Canal. The second longest canal in the world was the Ohio Erie Canal. Combined, they were almost 700 miles long, and they had been built, in uh, in a period of 15 years, and it transformed the country. It transformed not just the route along the Erie Canal, not just upstate New York. It transformed the nation. Millions of people poured into the Midwest. Mostly they were New Yorkers, New Englanders, immigrants. They brought with them, uh, you know, um, uh, a commitment to free labor. I mean, you have to ask yourself, if this had not been done, what would have happened in 1861 when the Civil War broke out? If that whole region was not populated by millions of productive, free citizens. Um, And I mean, this, you know, would we have seen Abraham Lincoln emerge as the national leader he did? This transformed America, and it proclaimed to the entire world the productive might, the creative and inventive capabilities of the American citizenry. So let's stop there, Tony.